Hi, I'm Jess. I'm here at the SoundWaters Coastal Education Center, gearing up for a day of exploring Cove Island Park. Cove Island Park is in Stamford, Connecticut, located on the shores of Long Island Sound. On our field trip today, we're going to learn all about the habitats of Long Island Sound, and we're going to learn a little bit about the animals and the plants that call this place home. The habitats found along the coast of Long Island Sound are very important to all the animals that call this area home. They provide areas for them to grow and for them to find food. There are a ton of examples in Cove Island Park of the different habitats we find all over Long Island Sound. My friend Nicole and I went adventuring to see if we can name them all. Let's start off by answering a simple question. What is a coastal habitat?
A coastal habitat is an area that animals live in, animals and plants live in, that can be where the water is very shallow all the way up into the high tide line.
And in Long Island Sound, our coastal habitats are part of something called an estuary. And an estuary is where salt water from the ocean meets fresh water from a river. Estuaries are very, very productive areas, so we're going to explore a few of the coastal habitats we find in our Long Island Sound estuary. We're in Cove Island Park in Stamford, Connecticut, where the SoundWaters Coastal Education Center is located. There are a bunch of different coastal habitats for us to explore. We're going to start off with learning about the coastal grasslands. So that's where I am right now. Coastal grasslands are made up of a whole bunch of different types of grasses and wildflowers and some small trees and shrubs. And the root systems here are really, really good at absorbing water and utilizing that water to grow. This area is very important to birds. I'm sure you can hear a few of them now. There are a lot of migratory birds that use this area to stop over as they migrate from usually their winter grounds up to where they'll nest. And they use this area to find food, and sometimes other birds also nest in here as well. Our next habitat's important to birds, and let's see where Nicola is.
I'm here at the salt marsh, and this is home to a bunch of different animals and plants. Some of these, like cordgrass, grow on top of old and dying cordgrass like we see here. So there's constantly more animals and plant matter growing on top of these. And this creates a dense organic layer called peat. And peat is really great at absorbing materials, which makes it really healthy for animals and plants that live here. We have some mussels here too that help hold together all of those root systems and all of this peat so that it doesn't move when the tide comes in and out. Not only do migratory birds use the salt marsh, but so do marine species because it's covered by water for half of its lifetime. So marine species like fish and crabs are able to use this as an area for a nursery habitat so they can lay their babies. And it's also important because they can get important food here.
I'm here at the rocky intertidal zone. Intertidal means between the tides. So this area is affected by two different types of tides. There's high tide and low tide. Right now, it's low tide. The water is pretty far out. During high tide, this whole area is covered by water. So there's a lot of water moving around. And the rocky intertidal zone has a lot of rocks. You can see them behind me over here. These rocks help to keep the mud in place so it doesn't all get washed away with the tide's movement. And also the animals that live in this area are adapted to living in between the tides as well. We have these guys that are called oysters. They're a type of bivalve. So they live inside of two shells that they keep shut tight like they are right now when the water is away. We also have some snails crawling around. Now Nicola is at our last habitat, one you're probably familiar with. Let's go check it out.
I'm here at the beach and it's characterized by, you guessed it, sand. And the sand is really important because it provides a different layer as you go down through the sand where water's trapped. And this is important for a lot of animals that live on the beach because they need a source of water. So you can see in my hand here, this is dry sand that's on the surface of the beach. But if we dig down a little bit, we have wet sand. So this wet sand is what provides all those nutrients for those animals living in it. And these animals living in it are little tiny invertebrates, which are bugs. And the bugs are eaten by species of birds. So they're an important halfway area for birds to stop over when they're migrating. Another animal that uses the beach often is the horseshoe crab. The horseshoe crab climbs up on the beach, and after they mate, they lay their eggs in the sand. And these eggs also, again, provide a lot of nutrients and food for different types of bird species like the red knot.
Today we explored some of the coastal habitats found along the shores of Long Island Sound and learned about their key features. These areas are very important to the health of the ecosystem.
They provide home and food for a bunch of different organisms within the Long Island Sound, so it's vital that we keep these places protected.
There are so many awesome habitats found here. I'm standing on the edge of Holly Pond. Holly Pond has a few examples of the habitats we just saw. There's a rocky intertidal zone, salt marsh, and the sandy beach. We like to call Holly Pond a nursery habitat. What do you think that means? What do you usually find in a nursery? You find babies. So in Holly Pond, we find a ton of baby animals, juvenile animals, and small animals. It's much more protected in here than it is out in the open Long Island Sound. This provides the animals with a safe space to grow and to start their lives. There aren't very many big animals hiding here. Scientists like to do population studies in this area to make sure that the population is healthy. If there aren't enough baby and juvenile animals, it won't sustain the population of that species. Why don't we go out and do a population study of our own to see what animals we can find in Holly Pond? I am all geared up and ready to do my population study. Wearing these big waterproof overalls called waders to keep me dry so I can walk out into the water. I have my life jacket on for safety, and I have my big net. Now this net is called a seine net. There are a few important things about it that we need to know. It has these noodles along the top. What do you think they do? They help keep it floating along the surface of the water. There are also metal pieces down at the bottom. What do you think they do? They help to keep it dragging along the ground. This way our net stays nice and open so we can collect all the animals that we'll find out here in Holly Pond. My friend Mike and I are all ready. Let's go see what we can find. We caught a few different species of animals in our seine net. We caught some grass shrimp. We have a few Atlantic silver sides. Those are a little type of minnow. We have a mud snail, even a few hermit crabs, and we caught comb jellies. All these animals survive very well in Holly Pond thanks to their adaptations. Do you know what an adaptation is? You probably do. There are actually a few different types of adaptations. My friends Tim and Christina know all about them. Let's go learn from them.
So Christina, what is an adaptation?
An adaptation is when an animal changes to survive in its environment.
Does this happen over a long period of time or a short period of time?
It takes a long time for an animal to adapt to its environment.
There are two different kinds of adaptations, behavioral and physical adaptations.
A behavioral adaptation is how an animal acts. A physical adaptation is something on the body that changes. So, for example, we have our polar bear. Let's think about where the polar bear lives. It lives in the Arctic. What do you see a lot in the photo? A lot of snow. So how does the polar bear adapt its body to hide or blend in with the snow? It has white fur. Another really cool thing the polar bear has are these really tiny ears, which help keep its body heat and it doesn't let cold water in. Another really great thing the polar bear has that helps him adapt is he has a large fat layer underneath all that warm fur. Now we have our flounder, which Tim is going to tell us all about.
A physical adaptation common to all fish are their gills. Gills are extremely important to animals that live in the water because unlike humans who breathe out of the water, animals that live in the water need to pull air out of the water. If you take a look at the flounder, you can see the gill flapping. His mouth opens to suck water in. He passes it over his gills, pulling oxygen out, and then pushing the rest of the water back out through the gill plate. We've been talking about physical adaptations, and now we're going to get into our behavioral ones. As a reminder, behavioral adaptation is something about the way an animal acts that helps it to survive.
A great example of a behavioral adaptation are birds. Birds migrate. Does everyone know what migrate means? It's when birds from the Arctic or Canada come down to the Long Island Sound in the wintertime because they like the warmer temperatures or to find food.
Another great example of a behavioral adaptation is seen here in our chocolate-fingered mud crab. A lot of animals act differently when there's a predator around. The chocolate-fingered mud crab's defense is to play dead. If I pick him up and poke him, he stops moving. A lot of predators won't eat an animal they think has already died.
Now you've learned all about the different adaptations. Let's go take a field trip to the Long Island Sound to see some special habitats.
We're here at our Coastal Education Center in Cove Island Park in Stamford, Connecticut, and I'm here at one of Long Island Sound's most important habitats, the salt marsh. Right now it's low tide, so you can see there's no water here. This area experiences high and low tide twice a day. At high tide, this area is filled with all kinds of life. We have shrimp, clams, oysters, mussels, fish, and birds that call this area their home. It's a super productive and very important habitat where animals grow up. So while you can't see them right now, when you go into the salt marsh, you can find evidence of our friend the fiddler crab. Over here you can see the holes where they dig their burrows.
The salt marsh is just one habitat that influences crab adaptations. Let's go check out another one. Here we are at the Rocky Intertidal Zone. That name might sound intimidating, but let's break it down. What do you see a lot of behind me? Rocks. Inter means within, and tidal means that there's tides that affect the area. So here we both have a low and high tide, just like the salt marsh. The crabs that live here, though, act in a very different manner than the fiddler crabs that live in the salt marsh. Let's go check under some rocks and find us some animals. Rocks are very important for the crabs and animals that live here. It holds the water underneath, so during low tide, when a lot of the water goes out, they still have that water underneath the rocks to utilize. So when you pick a rock up, make sure to put it right back down. Oh look, an Asian shore crab and a mud snail.
This is the Asian shore crab. They're one of the rocky shore's most common inhabitants, and they're actually an invasive species. That means that people actually introduced them here and they were able to adapt to our environment. Females lay up to 50,000 eggs at a time, and these guys will eat just about anything, which makes them great at surviving.
This is a mud snail. Mud snails happen to live in both the salt marsh and the rocky shore. One adaptation you'll notice right away is their shell. The shell is important for many reasons. One, to protect against predators, strong weather, and currents. It also helps the animal camouflage or blend in. When the animal is no longer alive, the shell also provides nutrients for other animals. This mud snail is also a decomposer, which is one of the most important jobs in this habitat. A decomposer breaks down the dead plants and animals. They also have a really cool tooth-like tongue called a radula. They scrape the food off the rocks with their tiny teeth that's located on the tongue. Eventually those teeth wear down and new ones grow. Imagine if your tongue had tiny teeth.
So today we learned all about adaptations, those things about an animal that help them to survive. We learned the two main kinds, physical and behavioral, and we also got to take a look at two of Long Island Sound's most important habitats and how different animals adapt to a different habitat to survive.
That's so interesting. I always find the chocolate-fingered mud crabs and Asian shore crabs in the Rocky Intertidal Zone, but I've never seen a fiddler crab there. It's pretty cool how well adapted the fiddler crab is to life in the salt marsh, while the chocolate-fingered mud crab is adapted to life in the Rocky Intertidal Zone. Each of the crabs is influenced by its surroundings, by the living and the non-living things in its ecosystem. Tim and Christina did some research into the Long Island Sound ecosystem. Let's go learn from them.
Check this out, Christina. I made my own ecosystem.
Ecosystem? What's an ecosystem?
An ecosystem is the combination of all living and non-living things in a specific area. We call living things biotic factors and non-living things abiotic factors. Let's go check out my favorite ecosystem, the Long Island Sound, and see what they look like out there.
Here we are in our local ecosystem, the Long Island Sound, or should I say, stuck in our local ecosystem. All around me are abiotic and biotic factors. Can you point out any biotic factors? How about this seaweed? Remember, biotic factors are living things, so they need to eat, drink water, and grow, just like humans do to survive. We're going to focus on 3 types of biotic factors. Our producers, such as the seaweed, that creates its own energy. Our consumers, like this mussel, who eats other producers or other living things in order to obtain energy.
And finally, our decomposer, which is this mud snail that breaks down dead things to obtain energy. Biotic factors need abiotic factors in order to survive. Can you see any abiotic factors around me? I'll give you a hint. This mud is an abiotic factor, meaning non-living. What makes something non-living? Well, does this mud eat, drink, grow? No. So this mud is classified as an abiotic factor. The Long Island Sound has 3 different types of bottom substrates: our mud, sand, and rock. These are all abiotic factors. How can abiotic factors help biotic factors to survive? Here we are at a rocky bottom, which is one of the busiest places in the Long Island Sound. This rocky bottom is an abiotic factor. It's a great place for animals to live, which are our biotic factors. These animals can hide in the crevices from prey, or, if they're a predator, hide and wait for their prey. The water level or a tide is another abiotic factor here because it influences how animals live.
Even though muddy flats are not quite as productive as our rocky reefs, we still have a lot of biotic factors here. We find a lot of bivalves like our clams, mussels, and oysters. We also find one other really important animal. This is a polychaete worm. Polychaete worms dig down into the mud and help to stir it up and move things around. While they're doing this, oxygen gets into the mud. A lot of other animals at the bottom rely on that oxygen. Temperatures are rising on planet Earth, and we don't know how the polychaete worm will adapt to those rising temperatures. If their populations go down, who knows how much oxygen will be getting down to the bottom of these muddy flats. They also provide a crucial food source for animals further up the food web. Sandy habitats like this one in the Long Island Sound create extremely important habitats for animals like hermit crabs, mantis shrimp, and the flounder. I have one sitting right here next to me. Can you see him? What we can see is that the sand, an abiotic factor, influences the way that the flounder, a biotic factor, behaves and acts. Their color is directly influenced by the sand and the way that they live. They'll camouflage on the bottom, hiding from their prey and from their predators in order to eat and survive. Together, abiotic and biotic factors create the cycles of life in the Long Island Sound that have been going on for tens of thousands of years. Over time, our cycles have begun to change, particularly recently. What do you think could have caused that?
Humans. For thousands of years, humans have been interacting with ecosystems. Tim is going to tell you a story about one particular species that has felt the effects of human interactions within ecosystems.
This is the lobster. They used to be extremely common in Long Island Sound, but aren't here quite as much as they once were. What's changed? The abiotic factors, particularly the temperature. It's been increasing around the world, but the effects have been felt a little bit stronger in the Long Island Sound. It's been increasing by almost 1 degree every 10 years. Doesn't sound like a lot, but to an animal like the lobster that likes colder water, it makes a huge difference. They simply cannot survive in warmer water. It also leads to them molting earlier, which is an issue for some diseases that happen on their shell. The other problem is that it's allowed one of their predators, the black sea bass, to be able to live in more parts of the Long Island Sound. The black sea bass likes warmer water and has been able to eat a lot of the smaller lobsters before they even get too big. Another factor that has influenced lobster populations in the Long Island Sound is a biotic one. On the shores of Long Island Sound used to be a lot of eelgrass, this nice habitat you see here. Young lobsters particularly like this habitat for digging their burrows and hiding in it. It also provided oxygen. Due to pollution in the 1930s, we lost a lot of this habitat. This is what it looks like now. Not quite the same picture and not as good of a habitat for the lobster. Fortunately, there are restoration projects going on throughout Long Island Sound, and we hope to see the lobster population recover. As time goes on, our abiotic and biotic factors are shifting faster than ever. We've seen the effects that it has on animals like the lobster, but it has also allowed new animals from warmer places to be able to live into the Sound. With every negative, there can be a little bit of positive as well. We'll just have to wait and see how the Long Island Sound adapts to those changes.
Today we talked about ecosystems and how abiotic and biotic factors influence those ecosystems. We also learned all about how humans can influence a certain type of species in the Long Island Sound, the lobster.
I never really thought about the abiotic things in an ecosystem. They can have a large impact on all the biotic factors. Biotic factors aren't only animals either. They include the plants too. Nicole and I went on an adventure around Cove Island Park to learn more about the plants. Let's go check it out.
Plants need a few simple things in order to survive. They need water, sunlight, nutrients, and air in some capacity. And the way that they work is they use all of these things to create their own food, which makes them primary producers. We're here at Cove Island Park in Stamford, Connecticut, and we're going to go around and see what kind of plants we can find on the shore.
We're going to start off with the plants that are along the coast, but not in the water. Here we are on the beach. This plant here is called beach grass. This beach grass is adapted to living in the sand. In the sand, there's not a lot of water available, so they're really good at keeping water inside of their leaves. They actually have ribs on their leaves that they use to roll up. By rolling up, they're reducing the amount of water that they lose from their leaves. Plants on the beach also need to adapt to limited nutrients. Living in soil, plants have nutrients all around them. In the sand, it can be harder to find. This right here is called seaside goldenrod. It's very well adapted to living in infertile soils, just like here on the beach.
Another plant that we find at the beach is the cocklebur. And this plant has a really cool adaptation because what it does is it releases seeds that have hooked appendages coming off of them. And this way, they're able to attach to things like your clothes, your hair, animals' fur, and all of that jazz. And they bring these seeds all over the place with them. And that way, new colonies of cockleburs can form. All of these plants along the beach have roots, and roots help bring up nutrients and water into their bodies. Why are these plants important to the ecosystem? Because they help stabilize the sand that they're in. They produce intricate root networks that help hold all of that soil and sand together so that it doesn't erode with tides and weather.
As we move closer to the water, plant life is more likely to be affected by the brackish water of Long Island Sound. We're here in the salt marsh. The salt marsh is a tidal wetland, so sometimes there's water in it, kind of like there is now during the high tide. When it's low tide, the water is away. There are certain areas of the salt marsh called salt pans. In a salt pan, after the tide goes away, some of the brackish water remains. It makes the salinity of the soil really, really high, so that means there's a lot of salt in it. It makes it really hard for plants to grow. We have one particular plant that grows really well here. This green right here is called glasswort. It's also called sea pickle. And their tubular shape, they're kind of shaped like a big tube, they are very good at holding water inside their bodies, and they actually can keep some of the salt inside there too. We just learned all about coastal plants. So those are plants that live on the land, along the shore. They have root systems, and they're only into contact with the water sometimes. Now we're moving on to marine plants. Marine plants grow in the water, so they're always in contact with it. And they're categorized into 3 different groups based on the color that they are. So there's brown, green, and red.
Let's start out with brown. Now this is our brown macroalgae. This is called rockweed. Rockweed has a really important adaptation. It has what are called air bladders. And these are like little pockets of air that are made inside its body to help it do something important. What do you think it does? It helps it float. This is because all seaweeds, just like plants on land and coastal plants, need sunlight in order to produce food.
Our next algae is a green algae. This is called sea lettuce. You might have seen it all over the beach. It's pretty common. So sea lettuce looks a lot different than our brown algae. If you look at the size of the leaves, they're huge compared to the leaves of the brown algae. It helps them absorb a lot of sunlight and absorb a lot of nutrients as well. The really cool thing about sea lettuce is when it gets washed up on the shore, and of course it dries out and it's not in the water anymore. But if the tide comes back in and gets it wet, it can actually reabsorb the water and continue to grow out in the water. Pretty cool.
We also had red algae. And this algae floats in clumps in the intertidal zone, so places where there are rocks, and it has something really important. They're called holdfasts. Unlike coastal plants that have root systems to help bring in nutrients and water into their bodies, these guys are surrounded by it all the time. So they don't need that. Instead, they need somehow to cling on to rocks so that they're not pushed around by the waves and the tidal forces. So they have these holdfasts in order to help them do that.
Today we learned all about the plants that live along the coast of Long Island Sound. Regardless of whether they live on the land or in the water, they have the same basic needs.
And all of them have different adaptations that help them contribute to marine ecosystems.
Plants are so cool. I always wondered what those little pricky things were that poke my feet and get stuck to my pants. Now I know what to avoid. All of the plants, animals, and habitats we've learned about so far are really affected by the tides. We've heard that word a bunch of times, and I'm sure we know the difference between high tide and low tide. But why do the tides even happen? How can the water move so far, and where does it even go? Tim and Christina know all about the tides. They're here to share with us.
Have you ever been to the beach, laid down your chair or towel, away from the water, and been nice and dry? And a little while later, you're not so dry anymore. That's because the tide has gotten higher. The alternating advance and retreat of water along the coastline is called a tide. There are two tides. High tide is when the water is at its furthest extent on the beach. Low tide is when it recedes all the way out to its furthest extent.
Here in Long Island Sound, we experience 2 high tides and 2 low tides every single day. The change from low to high or high to low is about 7 feet each time. That's about the distance from me to Christina. Other places on Earth have substantially larger high and low tide changes. Places like the Bay of Fundy in Canada have up to a 56-foot difference. That's about that far. This diagram shows how the gravitational pull of the moon affects the water on Earth's surface and pulls that water. The moon is over here and it's pulling the water from our oceans towards it. This causes a tidal bulge or a high tide here. You may be asking yourself, why then is it not low tide on this side? The reason is the Earth shifts away from the water on this side because it is also being pulled by the moon. The water over here isn't pulled by the moon because it's so far away from the moon that the gravitational pull isn't strong enough to shift it towards it. Otherwise, we would have low tide on this side as well. Because of these factors, we get 2 tidal bulges, which means 2 high tides at the same time. This also causes our 2 low tides. As water is being pulled this way and staying on this side, we get a low tide here and a low tide here. This changes throughout the day because the moon revolves around the Earth. The moon's revolution is a little bit longer than the Earth's rotation. It's 24 hours and 50 minutes. If we break that up, that's about 6 hours and 12 minutes for every quarter around the Earth. As the moon rotates, if it was over here, it would now be high tide on this side.
The animals of the Long Island Sounds depend very highly upon our tides. They use it to escape predators, and the predators also use it to catch their prey. These tides can wash out small fish into deeper areas where these predators might be waiting. It's also really important for our Long Island Sound because it helps bring in a fresh nutrient cycle. The Long Island Sound is an estuary, so it's blocked by land except for the Atlantic Ocean coming in. The Atlantic Ocean brings in fresh water with fresh nutrients so that these animals can survive and be a really productive environment. The third reason being for transportation of animals to different habitats. This is a habitat filled with animals of the Long Island Sound and is very affected by tides. This is called the intertidal zone. There's a lot of animals that depend on the tides here. When it's high tide, the water comes all the way up, completely covering our intertidal zone. But when low tide comes, the water washes away and exposes our animals. So these animals have to adapt to high tide and low tide pressures. The difference between high and low tide is something that's very important to boat captains. Let's head down to the harbor and meet the captain of the schooner SoundWaters to learn more.
We're here with Captain BG of schooner SoundWaters. We've been learning about tides, BG. How do the tides affect your job?
So when you're driving a boat, high tide and low tide could mean the difference between a lot of water and a little bit of water. So when you're driving a boat and it's high tide, you have more available water, and at low tide, you have to be more careful of where you're going.
How do you know where you need to be careful where you're going? How do you know that it's okay to be there?
So NOAA has completed a bathymetric scan, and that's a mapping of the sea floor. And then they take that data and they put it onto a chart. And on the chart, there's small numbers, and that gives us the given depth of the water in that area.
And how do you know what time high or low tide is on any given day?
So there's many apps on your phone that you can use to determine high and low tide. And then we also have the Eldridge, which gives you the different times of high and low tide.
So as we've been learning, it's exactly 6 hours, 12 minutes, and 30 seconds apart, which makes it predictable. Thanks, Captain VG.
Thank you.
Today we talked about what a tide is, where we can find them, what causes them, and we even got to meet our schooner captain VG.
The tides are pretty amazing. You can go to the beach in the morning, and by the afternoon, it'll look completely different. The tide can even start to go up into rivers. And there are a ton of rivers that flow down into Long Island Sound. The health of these rivers is so important. Tim and Christina went out to a local river and did something called a bioassessment to see how healthy the river is. Let's go learn from them.
When asked what type of water is in the Long Island Sound, you might say salt, but it's actually brackish. You might be asking yourself, what is brackish water? It's a mixture of fresh and salt water. The salt water comes from the Atlantic Ocean, but where does the fresh water come from? It comes from lakes, ponds, rains, and rivers. Rivers are very crucial to the Long Island Sound because it can bring in a lot of different nutrients or pollution. Today we're going to assess the health of a local river right here in Stamford.
We are here in Mianus River Park in Stamford, Connecticut. Rivers like these are crucial. In the United States, we have 250,000 rivers. In Connecticut alone, we have over 50, totaling 5,828 miles of river. Mianus River Park starts all the way up in North Castle, New York, and runs down through Stamford and on the border of Greenwich and all the way out to Long Island Sound. This river alone provides 100,000 people with their drinking water. It's important to assess the health of rivers like these because of the sheer amount of water they contribute to the Long Island Sound. You might be thinking, we need some kind of fancy, super cool equipment. You really just need your hands and a net. We're going to be looking for animals that live on the bottom of the riverbeds. Because they spend their lives here, they're good indications of how healthy the river is. We call creatures like these bioindicators. The ones that live on the bottom here are all invertebrates. Let's see what they look like. In order to take our sample, we need a couple things. We have this net with a really fine mesh. As you may be able to imagine, some of the animals that live in the water here are very small. That fine mesh helps to catch them. We put the net downstream of our site. We take a little scraper, about a meter of space in front of me, and we're just going to scrape the bottom back and forth for about a minute. Any rocks in our area about this size, we're going to scrape our hand around to get any of those insects off of and into our net.
In the 1 short minute it took to scrape the rocks, we found many different invertebrate species.
The Connecticut DEEP puts together a lot of information on how tolerant or intolerant these species are to pollution. There are different ratings going from 0 and up, and the lower the number, the less tolerant a species is to pollution. So if we see a lot of invertebrates that are very intolerant to pollution, that means that we have a healthy river. If we were to only see invertebrates that are tolerant to pollution, we might have some reason to have concern. We're going to take a look at what we have and do our own bioassessment. Let's take a look at what we found. In our first tray here, we have a plant case maker caddisfly. This bug has a tolerance value of 1. That's almost as low as we can go. This is a very sensitive animal. In our next tray over here, we have a brush-legged mayfly. Their tolerance value is a 2. Again, extremely low. This one right here is a 3-tailed, flat-headed mayfly with a tolerance value of 4. A little bit less intolerant, but still a little bit on the sensitive side. We also have a common net spinner caddisfly right here, which has another tolerance value of 4. These are again considered moderately sensitive. And our last one, not considered sensitive, but a cool find nonetheless, is a small crawfish. Based on everything we saw, we can really only conclude one thing. This is a healthy river. If this was an unhealthy and polluted river, what we would see is a lot of animals that are tolerant to pollution, with higher numbers on that scale we saw earlier. Instead, we saw overall animals that are moderately sensitive or extremely sensitive to pollution. This is a really good sign for this river. If it was unhealthy, we wouldn't see those. It's important that we continue to monitor it because this water is headed right down to Long Island Sound.
Here in Connecticut, we routinely monitor the health of our streams. In the past 40 years, rivers in Connecticut have greatly improved health-wise, according to a U.S. Geological Survey study. Environmental agencies, scientists, and volunteers are helping to make healthier freshwater inputs into the Long Island Sound.
Today we took a look at the Mianus River. We did a bioassessment and checked on the animals that live down on the bottom of the water. These animals told us that this was a healthy river.
Thank you for joining me. I had so much fun learning about all the coastal habitats of Long Island Sound and the animals and plants that call this area home. All these plants and animals are specifically adapted to life along the shore of Long Island Sound. Any changes to their ecosystem could have a negative impact on the population size. It's extremely important for us to do everything that we can to make sure that Long Island Sound stays healthy so all the plants and animals can survive and thrive here.